The Matrix is a system, Neo. That system is our enemy. But when you're inside, you look around. What do you see? Businessmen, teachers, lawyers, carpenters, the very minds of the people we are trying to save. Until we do, these people are still part of that system. That makes them our enemy. You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it. Are you listening to me, Leo? Are you listening? Are you listening? Are you listening?
All right, my name is Patrick Farnsworth. I host the podcast Last Born in the Wilderness, and the focus of this podcast is to discuss and navigate the territory that we've all entered in collectively. There's a lot of things that are happening politically, economically, environmentally, things that are happening within our own hearts and our own minds as individuals, and something that we're all connected to collectively. We all feel that something is wrong. We all sense that something is changing, and the very ground and the very framework in which we were accustomed to existing in is not making sense anymore. So the title Last Born in the Wilderness is kind of strange, especially, well, not for a podcast. There's some pretty weird names for podcasts out there. But Last Born in the Wilderness is kind of this ambiguous feeling about it. You know, what does that even mean? It's almost, I had someone named Bio Akamalafe, who I interviewed. When I emailed him, he's like, ooh, it sounds really apocalyptic and kind of ominous, which is funny because I tend to cover those types of subjects in this podcast. I'm not an optimistic person by nature, but I definitely feel like there is room to hope for the better, because I think the more that we understand why human beings are acting the way they are and why our systems are failing us, then we can move towards better alternatives, better structures, better ways of imagining a world that is much better and more beautiful than the world that we currently reside in. And that means working through your own inner struggles, inner drama, if that's the right term, but also recognizing that it's happening on the collective level as well. And trying to make sense of that is what this podcast is all about. I'm kind of terrified, and I think you're a little terrified. I think right now we're seeing so many unprecedented events taking place so rapidly that we don't really know what to do about it. We feel paralyzed with fear and shock, and we expect that our political institutions and our economic entities, corporations, etc. are going to figure this out for us, and that all we have to do is vote every few years and everything is going to fall into place. It is proving that that is not going to work any longer. We need to come up with alternatives. We need to think of these problems in a completely different way. And so what I attempt to do in my own very small way is to highlight people and highlight subjects that need to be expressed at this time, so that we can move forward through these tragedies, through these massive devastation that is occurring worldwide, through all of these various crises, and we can come out the other side a better species. So podcasting is a great means to express these ideas, and it also feels to me like I'm working through these problems. I'm working through my own sense of alienation and aloneness, and being able to express this creatively and put it out there for others to understand. So it's just my very small contribution to the discussion that I think we're all collectively having right now, and in our own way of trying to wrap our heads around the catastrophes that are currently underway. You can find everything you need to know about this podcast at the website lastborninthewilderness.com. Everything you need to know will be there. I have a Patreon page, so if you'd like to support what I'm doing, you can make very small monthly contributions. And to those that are already contributing, actually some of them are in this room right now, I am very thankful and grateful for what people are able to give. we live in a time of great peril, of uncertainty. We are witnessing massive devastation occurring every fuck. God damn it! Why do I sound?
Nuance. Noun. A subtle difference in or shade of meaning. Expression. Or sound.
Nuance. Noun. A subtle difference
Nuance.
in or shade of meaning.
Noun.
Expression.
A subtle
or
difference
sound.
in or shade of meaning.
Noun.
Expression.
A
or
subtle
sound.
difference in or shade of meaning,
Nuance.
expression, or sound.
Noun. A subtle difference in or shade of meaning, expression, or sound.
Like a game show or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
It has like kind of a game show quality to it.
That's the overbrightness probably. Let's see.
Oh yeah, there it is.
Maybe that's what
Okay.
Who knows? Who cares? It's still funny. I don't care. I'm in a makeshift studio, so it's like we moved to a new house, and so we just have everything in a back room. So what's behind me is an old big screen TV, but it's on a mount that I have a piece of green cloth draped over, and a desk lamp giving me light. So it's pretty ghetto, but I figured it out. It seems to be working.
I think it's awesome. Yeah,
All right,
there's
so
another
go ahead and lead us in, however you want to do that.
Yeah. No. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for doing this. I've been wanting to talk about policing. I did an episode, I think, last year with a sociologist, and he had written a book. His name was Alex Vitale, and he had written a book called the End of Policing. And it's always something I've been extremely, interested in. But what really sparked my interest in getting a hold of you, it's a little personal, but there's a relative of mine. He's actually really.
You know what, Patrick?
He just joined the police,
I'm
and
going to go ahead and say you win on the audio because you broke up. So go ahead and cut your video. See how it does.
okay, yeah.
Yeah. So start that over. I'm sorry, but you broke up on my end. So I want to make sure you sound good. You're right about the audio. This is what me and my buddy do too. When the video's rough, we just cut it. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, so basically the reason why I wanted to contact you is it was relevant to something that I've been kind of grappling with in my own world, which is that somebody that's close to me, is related to my wife. I'm not going to say exactly who he is, just for the sake of anonymity, but he is joining the police department, joining the police here where I live, and his main motivation and his main reason, and I think it's actually a good reason, is he wants to join Fish and Game because I live out here in Idaho. So he has to be a police officer for I think 2 years or something like that before he could get into that position. But I've always struggled with policing as a concept, as an idea, and particularly what I think is fascinating about your story is you were a police officer for what, 11 years?
Right.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
You were in Baltimore, which is, it's very different from where I live.
Yeah, at least, I don't know. I think at its core, it's really not, but we can get into that.
Yeah, we definitely could. But I would just say basically that urban environment, and it's a little more, I think, intense. But I what I find interesting is I've talked to former police officers who left because they started to really see the inner workings of a police department, and it did not jive with their ethics or their morals. It did not jive with what they maybe originally felt that policing is supposed to embody, at least in their minds and in their hearts. So I wanted to ask, I know you've talked about this probably a million times on countless other podcasts, but to give a little bit of background on who you are and what your experience was with policing, and what kind of drew you, what kind of pushed you away from being a part of that any longer? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So let me do it in the quickest way possible, and so I'll just go through real fast. Basically, I was a 90s kid who grew up in a mixed race, low income area where in that time, there wasn't a lot of talk of race. We were kind of race blind. And So I grew up in that kind of normal, no discussion about race, wanted to do something good for our country. I was a hellion and a little prone to acts of aggression. So I focused that in going into the Marine Corps where I could get an education. And I felt like that was kind of like what society tells you is the good thing to do, to go ahead and do that, kind of get you bumped out of that low income, low class thing. So I went into the Marine Corps. Of course, I learned in the Marine Corps, I learned how to kill, which, you can make national arguments for. That's not my point. Not all killing is bad. So then I went and translated those skills to where they do translate into policing. I applied at a bunch of different police departments. Baltimore ended up taking me. I'm from there, from the suburbs of Baltimore. And then I go into policing as a foot patrol guy, going through the academy. I'm a little shocked at the academy by like how unprofessional we are coming directly from the Marine Corps. I go out onto the streets and start making arrests and starting a police career, walking foot, and then you end up getting into a car. I end up being in patrol. Then I went into essentially if you watch The Wire and you watch cops jump out of the car and like jack people up on the corner. I did that for a couple years, and then I went to a major case narcotics unit, worked in not necessarily undercover. I was more like hidden, covert surveillance kind of thing. Made a bunch of big gang busts there, did a bunch of operations, and then got promoted, went into supervision and command staff, started dealing with the inner workings of the police department. I first got real, surprised by the amount of racial issues within our department, like objective ones, like promotional issues, getting punished more, things like that within the police department, and kind of started to address those things, thinking that we were really unprofessional and all we had to do was do things more professionally. So I wrote this 518-page guide as I was doing my lieutenant studies to like perfectly encapsulate and level the playing field for what cops need to know and how they can break into the system, because good old boys control information. So I broke that mold and got the information to everybody. And then eventually, as I continued going on and seeing the inner workings, seeing how things played out, I began to realize then that it wasn't that we weren't policing properly or we weren't doing it professionally enough. I started to see that perfect policing meant that we blinded the public from the reality of what was taking place. So if I can use Freddie Gray's killing in Baltimore for an instance where he died in the transport, in the custody of police, going from an arrest scene to the booking office. And so that is something where we are in control of somebody's life. And we have all the responsibilities in the world to do that, to get them to the prison cell safely. But we were locking Freddie Gray up in that incident for essentially no crime at all. He was being a person that grew up in that neighborhood. Yeah, he had former drug arrests, but this is not what was happening at the time. That's not what he got busted for. He essentially got busted for living in that neighborhood and ended up going and being transported safely dying on his way to jail. But our idea became of perfect policing in that instance, not that he wasn't arrested and put into the social inequalities that were going to result from a result of being incarcerated, where you get fines, aggressive taxation, all these issues. So as far as we were concerned, perfect policing was getting him into a way that would be illegal to treat dogs, but you wouldn't see it. So we're like, as long as we don't see it, then we're happy with it. So then I started to get back to the fundamental core philosophically of what policing is and how that needed to be completely rebooted. But I left policing because I was injured. This had nothing to do with some kind of moral stance on my end. I'm glad it took place that way. And one reason why I'm able to be more vocal is because I had that security of being injured and being put into the pension program, not being abandoned like most whistleblowers would be. So I ended up going to a scholarly path after I left, trying to find a solution for this problem that I found. And then as my scholarly endeavors took me to realize how we're completely misaligned with our politics and with how policing is, who policing really serves. So policing has these fundamental pillars that it's constructed off of in America. And no matter what you do with those things, they're going to end up bad for everybody involved in the entire country. They actually harm society, and that crime, the things that actually cause crime, are none of the things that any police department is addressing at all. Things like we can go with basic things once I got into scholarship, like crime is a measurement of police activity, not a citizen's activity. So even when you start basing on what are cops basing their decisions off of, well, crime data. But crime data does not mean what people are doing. It is literally what cops are doing. So it's the measurement of all the societal bias that's put into policing is actually what the measurement of crime is, because we're not objectively looking for crime. We're looking where we look is where we find crime, because crime is everywhere. So it's more of where you're looking. So little concepts like that, where you start to realize all the data is completely corrupted, that you're misaligned with your incentives and your disincentives for how something can happen. So a politician is in charge of policing. And we already know that deterrent from violence, of the threat of going to jail or the threat of the death penalty is not an effective deterrent. It doesn't do anything. People don't suddenly go in a moment of rage, go, oh yeah, that's right. They increased the penalties for murder from 20 to 25 years. Fuck, what am I doing? Since that doesn't take place, then what we know is that other things are causing crime, and we need to respond in other ways, but we don't. We keep double down on this idea that we can deter violence, or that violence is a rational response, when they're not. They're irrational responses, which means they're in the purview of public health. And all the data says they're in the purview of public health, but every incentive and everything in controlling all of policing in America is done by a politician who has personal goals of 4 years. So they want to do things like lock everybody up, because that will lower the crime in a temporary window. You won't be able to do it in the long haul. You can do it in that window because everyone's in jail, so they're not committing crime. Fuck everyone's civil rights. So because you have these fundamental misalignments, you have to reboot that. So I developed a system in my PhD work that was all in a possibility for how we could do that. That's called civilian or citizen-led policing. So where we want to go throughout that message is perfectly fine, but it's super hard to sum that up. So that was like 6 minutes.
No, that's wonderful. We could go, there's so many details that we could expound on here. But one thing I want to hone in on is that I often find that, if you study group psychology, human beings, you realize that people are pretty susceptible to groupthink. Yeah. I mean, if you are a part of an organization, I mean, it can be on the macro level of a nation state and nationalism. I mean, you get into that, but you get into the smaller groups where you have, like a police department. Maybe, I don't know how many people on average work within a police department, but if they operate within this group, a lot of things get glossed over in the individual's perception. They tend to write off certain things that they maybe, if they were outside of it and they had the ability to think a little more individually or a little more independently, they might see, oh, that thing that I did, or that thing that I kind of let just happen, well, that was a little fucked up. Like, I didn't think about it at the time. I justified it, or I rationalized it, but there were things that just didn't sit well with me now in retrospect. Mm-hmm. Was there anything like that for you? I mean, I feel like often...
Me too. I never believed in the drug war to begin with. So,
yeah.
I would go a little bit step further and say that the groupthink on when it comes to policing is in society. It is society as a whole. Policing is what society chooses to do when all the chips are on the table. We have this thing where we look at the individual cops, and I really have tried to do everything I can to steer people away from this, because as you were saying, human beings operate off of these subconscious incentives, and that's where I really think we're talking about what police officers do themselves. There's these subconscious incentives and disincentives to go to certain behavior, and I actually think the groupthink, the culture of policing, isn't really that bad. They think they're serving the public. They think that consequentially their actions will end up better in the end results. They actually just don't know their jobs at all, and they don't know the history of them. They're not taught it. These things were kept out of the sciences on purpose, because history was, I mean, we like to say whitewash, but it's always washed by the victor. So we don't hear the truth of what policing does, because policing is paid for and is the tool of the elite. It is the tool of the victor. And so they don't want anybody to know where they truly come from. They just want to build up this idea of service and this culture, this groupthink, that you're actually doing something good, while the underlying system of disincentives and incentives guide you to a different action. So what I mean by this is, I need dumb things. I'm going to give you a really dumb example and how it can come up to really bad results. So I had tattoos. I have sleeve tattoos on both my arms. And the police department had decided that they wanted to have people, the officers, I had to wear long sleeves all year long. I had to cover tattoos and things like that. So it was part of my big issue that I wanted to be someplace where I didn't have to worry about my tattoos and whether I showed them or not. So there were two avenues. One was being a detective that wore like regular suits and worked into an office, and the other one was to go out onto the streets and do like that rough and tumble type of drug work. So the way you get into these things, my first choice, because you get choices, like the detectives get to choose when they want. When I applied, and IID, Internal Affairs, was the first one that I went to, and because I kind of was a rough and tumble cop, it didn't end up even being accepted there. I never even got into the door because other people complained that one of those street cops was going to be coming into their realm. So I needed to get into a different type of thing, which was drug work. And all my incentives would be to make a bunch of arrests, because the people who make the arrests are the people who stand out and get into those units. At that time, this is where people hear me talking about going to other neighborhoods, but at the time I was working in a very wealthy, essentially white, old money neighborhood in Baltimore. There's 2 or 3 of them that still exist. And so I wasn't going to get my numbers there. So I left my area, went to Park Heights to the poor black neighborhood, and was making a ton of arrests so I could get into that unit. So while I wasn't thinking to myself, I'm going to go into this area and do all these things, this was the area where society allowed me to get away with this. This is the area where the police department didn't care that I was leaving my jurisdiction. I was getting those stats. These are the ways to get to the unit. I was told the whole time that this was good. You have to be outside of it, like you said, to even begin to get a perspective. And even if you're beginning to get that perspective, you kind of will give yourself this backfire effect, and you'll give other people around you a backfire effect, because criminology and criminal justice itself is basically a religion. So you're not only going to say that you were wrong your whole life. It's what you were telling everybody your whole life you were wrong. You're wrong about what your parents did, what your friends at work did, everything that you were kind of even praised for doing, you're saying was wrong once you make that admission. So it would be like being a Christian your whole life and your dad being a big, huge pastor, and then you just coming out and shunning everything and saying this was all wrong. Those conflicts would obviously isolate.
Yeah, definitely. And you pointed to in the beginning that many officers, many cops don't have any historical perspective on the roots of policing. When you were doing your research, I mean, was there anything that really stood out to you when you started to research the history of policing in the United States or any other parts of the world that really showed to you oh, that's where some of these problems really stem from?
Yeah, so basically, in America, policing originates in the Western idea, which is obviously going to be England's policing style. And England's policing is based off of Sir Robert Peel, the Peelian principles. And I think these principles are kind of crap, but about half of them are good, and they're a lot better now than what we do in America, because they didn't have these other influences. And the history of American policing is where these influences make things bad. So while I don't agree with Peelian principles, they're still a lot better. So we start from that point, and when the policing concept comes over to America, the first thing that we start looking for, and the first policing that gets built up, is to protect your area, your tribe. So you end up with these tribalistic fears, and you say, well, we need to authorize people who will quell these fears from us, keep us feeling safe. It's a perception of safe, not a real safety. So the first things that they ended up forming police for, and you have to have money to pay for them, in America, was to catch runaway slaves and have them taken back to their slaveholders. This was from the north. So northern people would catch the slaves and take them back down because they didn't want them in their neighborhoods, even though they wanted them to be free. They didn't belong there, made them feel less safe. So they're participating and following the law of the natural perspective. So you end up with the real first policing in America ends up being these, they're called slave patrols. I mean, the original badge, anyone can search it. The original police badge from America, the Sheriff's Star, comes from the original slave patrol badge. It's a direct ascendancy. So And this was in Boston. Anybody can look that up. This is not a mystery. But it's
Yeah,
just
no,
things you
it's
don't
just
come across.
crazy. Just
It is
crazy the
crazy.
direct connections there, like that they weren't even able to like, oh, let's come up with a new symbol. No, that's the same thing. Sorry to interrupt you, but
It's
yeah,
totally the same
it's
thing.
crazy.
And to make it worse, so that's your first crime data. And so the first crime data is who is committing the crimes. Well, runaway slaves are breaking that first rule. So who is able to run away, physically capable of running away and trying to find something? Well, the males who are between the ages of 16 and 24, which is still historically who commits the most crime. Black males between the ages of 16 and 24. It remains true in a direct ascendancy today because that's what we're looking for. Because crime is not a measurement of what people do. It's a measurement of what the cops do. So cops are still looking in that direction as they always have because you end up justifying it in a snowball effect. Well, why are you doing this? Because that's what was done before, because that's who commits the crime, obviously, who's in jail, but they were in jail beginning historically with these original problems to begin with. So the first pillar that I talk about of American policing is that it's built off of is the creation and maintenance of oppressed classes, and then the manipulation of those classes to use those people to create police officers and then enact the oppression on their own people, and funding their own existence through things like progressive taxations and civil forfeitures and things like that. So every action of policing is based off of one of these three things that stood out that I'll end up talking about. So that's the first one, is the creation, maintenance, and slave of oppressed classes. So one reason why we end up saying black is not real, it is races aren't real. Tired of having that argument. Period. They were created in America in the early 1600s, and it was done to divide. And then the policing was used to enforce that rule. So the lowest on the totem pole, there you go, saying inappropriate comments, totem pole. But the lowest one on that list would have been blacks at that time, because those were the ones who were most unfamiliar, and they were the full slaves. So the indentured servants and the white slaves, which were typically the Irish and the Italian at that time, they ended up being like your first real cops, because, I mean, we're not going to fucking do that kind of grimy work. So we're take members of these oppressed classes that we're taking, we'll give them a little bit more privilege and a little bit more pay so that we were more familiar with them, and then they can keep those black people away from us, is essentially how it started. And those concepts root in and continue to this day. So then going on into the second thing that all policing does is it protects the property of the elite over the lives of the members of the oppressed class, whether they're cops or regular citizens. All the oppressed classes, and typically, I mean, all low income is an oppressed class. So it's pretty much the vast majority of America is going to fall into one oppressed class or another, who are getting these resources extracted from. Because we're not elite. The elites are the rarities. But the elites' properties, that's who we protect. So a good example of this I always use is when you talk about the Baltimore riots, uprising. A lot of people are familiar with it and seeing the things burned down, and they would make comments. One of the most common being, why are they burning that CVS down? Well, the CVS is the only corporate representative in that entire neighborhood. It's the only global operation that's going on and the only symbol of economic inequality. So that's what they attack and burn down. But what do the cops do? Well, the city's burning all over, but the cops form a protective line around the CVS, not the Korean store owner down the street, not the citizen's house who has windows broken to, not the grocery store down the street, not the video store, not the smoke shop. They protect the CVS. They protect the property of the elite, not even the property of the locals, because those are oppressed class members. The third thing that policing does is the original kind of Mounties and slave patrol were also utilized along with soldiers to continue the genocide of the Native American people, and you will see that go out throughout history with cops participating in that. And then that's why I participated in Standing Rock, because all three of those things were in clear display in Standing Rock, where you had a police force who was members of the oppressed classes, the poor, who was paid for by that entire area of oppressed classes, who were then directly serving corporate interests of trans whatever that was, trans partnerships. Somebody can fill me on.
Yeah.
And then they were continuing that genocide on Native American land, taking that culture away and serving the elites, not the people who they were supposed to be protecting and serving.
No, that's a great overview. I know that when I've heard other interviews that you've been in, and you don't like to say that you're not a part of any end of the political spectrum. As far as I can tell, you don't really identify as being a leftist or a liberal or conservative or any of that, right? Like you're pretty like, I don't want to label myself because that would limit my analysis. That would limit your ability to at least attempt to look at it objectively. But
All
you're
things
but
that
in
necessitate an ism. All.
yeah. And but what you're basically saying is all the things that I come from a leftist perspective, generally speaking, and everything you're saying fits pretty neatly within a leftist critique of the state, of policing, of white supremacy, of all of those things. I mean, and again, I'm not trying to put you in a box, but
Lots of leftist ideas.
yeah, but I imagine it must be frustrating to talk with people who that's like a trigger. Like once you start talking about white supremacy and its connection to policing, or what happened with Standing Rock or any of these things that you were participated in, it must be incredibly frustrating to try to articulate through your own personal experience and your own scholarly research what is actually true, which it may have a leftist, I guess it fits neatly within a leftist analysis, but then again, it's kind of objectively true. So I just imagine from your perspective, like what is it like to kind of be, thrown into certain categories? And I mean, I know you've been doing this, I don't know how many hundreds of podcasts you've been on. I'm sure you've been boxed in all the time. So I just wanted to get a feel of like how you feel about that.
I think it bothered me before more than it does now. I think I kind of took it personal. Like I started to feel that my what was I was saying was wrong, or the backlash was about me. It wasn't about what I was trying to say. And now I kind of see it as this backfire effect. If anybody wants to look up the backfire effect, it's a psychological phenomenon. And I think largely that's what I'm dealing with, because what I do, being obsessed with staying as objective as possible and avoiding the labels, means I attack the labels. And when you attack the labels, most people have taken one of or more of those labels into their personal identity. And then I am attacking your personal identity. So while I can have a conversation with you and I sit here and we're both, I mean, yes, my ideas are on the left spectrum. No arguing against that would be foolish. So here we are, two people with ideas on the left spectrum, and most people would think that the bulk of, say, Black Lives Matter type of thinking would be comfortable in this conversation. But I said that race is not real, and I'm telling them they're not black. It's not a thing. So that immediately attacks the core, the personal identity of who they are. So then everything else I said gets lost because it feels like a personal attack. So where I am now is trying to figure out how to articulate destroying personal identity without offending you, and I think that that's impossible. So I've kind of become more abrasive, I think. I was really stepping back from being abrasive, and now I'm like, whatever. I'm just whatever it is. I can't appease either side of the argument because I'm not in the argument. I care about fighting oppression and fighting violence. And when you're on a team, then you are interested in being the oppressor. So your core logic is that I'm applying this broadly, but if anyone wants to object with me, I'm interested in how it could not be. As soon as you adapt to those teams, what you're saying is fundamentally your idea is right. And if only you have the power to oppress, then things will be better. And that's just not where I operate.
Right. Yeah, it's something I've talked with others about is, you talked about the white supremacy and by doing that, you're acknowledging that these identities do exist, that people are attached to these identities, and that white people and black people, they find some sort of maybe empowerment from identifying
Sure.
with these labels, right? And it doesn't just apply to race, this applies to practically anything. I mean, people who are sports fans, you know, they identify very strongly with their team, and you know, they're willing to fight people on the street over some dumb shit that happened in a game. You know, it's insane. Like, I watch it, like, I almost feel like an alien anthropologist watching people sometimes. I'm like, this is such a fucking weird thing that's happening right now. But anyway, you know, you're saying, like, yes, being black doesn't exist, being white doesn't exist, but this is kind of where I feel it's tricky. It's like a catch-22, because I want to address that these social constructs, race is a social construct. It was constructed to benefit a small group of people hundreds and hundreds of years ago. It allowed for the slave trade to exist for as long as it did, which is one of the most economically prosperous, like, what am I trying to say here? It was incredibly, I can't remember how much money they were making, but it was an insane amount of capital. That was, yeah, it was a lot. I mean, it's insane. And you think about how much
you don't have to spend much to get a lot out of it.
Yeah, exactly. And so, in order to address the grievances of hundreds of years of oppression, of violence that has been enacted against whole groups of people, it's like, to me, it's a tricky game of saying you're not black or you're not white, you are a human being, and you fit very neatly into a category that was constructed for you, and that we need to move away from that. Okay, that's true, but then there's that tricky thing, well, because I've been oppressed because of the color of my skin, identifying as black, identifying as this or that, allows me to cultivate power, you know, a sense of identity with other people who are oppressed as well. And I find that, like, a really difficult dance, especially, again, I'm white. I don't have any, you know, I don't have any of the grievances that many people of color would have regarding my privilege, right? But I don't know, like, how do you approach that? Because to me, that seems like the trickiest game of all, acknowledging the importance of a person's experience in America, while also saying, hey, your identity is constructed out of kind of bullshit in a lot of ways. It's difficult.
So I would say that the vast majority of what we would consider the black community already totally gets that and agrees. Who we hear from is really an almost irrelevantly small portion of the population. And so I have definitely taken a more direct approach to that lately. I used to try and sugarcoat it, and I have found that to be completely ineffective, or maybe even just a waste of time, because there's no easy way to say. I mean, let's just put it in the harsh terms. I like to put it out there so that people understand. If someone in power calls you a nigger, and you say, well, I'm going to, you know what? I'm going to find power in that, and I'm going to call myself a nigger. The purpose was to make you a nigger, and you played it out. So you were playing and serving their game. So it's the same thing as the first pillar of policing. The biggest trick that power plays on us is getting us to execute our own demise. And the minute you classify yourself or your child as black, as lesser than the white, because that is the concept, and you will never find power in that. You will find pride, sure, but it is a false power. It's a false pride. You must become, like Martin Luther King said, I mean, these are fundamental principles from the past, that you must be judged on the content of your character, not the color of your skin. And the moment you think that you have some position that is better than somebody else because of your race, yeah, sorry, that makes you racist. It is racist that Harvard makes it harder for Asians to get in than it does black people. That is racist. And I am interested in fighting all forms of oppression. And if you're interested in being the oppressor, well, then we're not making the same argument. I don't know how to do anything but present you with the reality and hope that at some point in time, you will either have an argument that makes me change my mind, or you will find a way to participate in society in a way that is more realistic. We should be talking about these things in the histrionics. So while I say that race isn't real, well, racism is. But racism is from the oppressor. It is the perspective of someone else. It is someone else saying you are lesser because of this label. That's why when people say, "Are you white?" I'm not saying that. I'm just not. Have I benefited and played into the game of being categorized as white? Certainly. And you do the exact same thing being black. You just justify it in your own way, because it's about, once you have a team of being black, then it's saying that once this team is in power, then we can be the benevolent oppressor. But no one can be the benevolent oppressor. The oppression ruins the benevolency.
Mm. Yeah, and before we move on to, I want to talk about the civilian-led policing and your ideas with that. But I want to just, one thing that I wanted to touch on is that policing is one part of the justice system, right? The as it is called, it's not really about justice as much as anything else. But to me, like
That's a good point.
I talked to Alex.
Talk about that. Let's talk about that real quick. So,
oh yeah,
so justice, the way I have seen it and understand it is, we as Americans define justice as revenge plus equality. And it's not just an eye for an eye. It's like an eye for an eye plus. It's not turn the other cheek. It's not do the thing that the left should be doing, especially as liberals. The number one principle should be that all people are inherently good. So justice cannot possibly be revenge. Justice has to be something like attacking the causations, so you reduce the chances of it occurring again in the future. You can never make it up. There is no justice for what has transpired. There is only justice for people that come after the event. So when it comes to the same thing like reparations, it's impossible. There's just no pathway for it not being racist. You can't undo racism with racism. So what reparations has realized is that we need to get into like the civilian-led policing area that you get into, but it's about equitable representation and the ability to have a say at the table. It cannot be to control what is done at the table, especially when you're the minority. You will never get what you think is justice if you think that is overcoming the power and will of the majority. It's just fundamentally foolish. But yes, so justice, as we have become to think of it, is this idea where the elites are protected, for one, and then revenge plus equality, when we need to fundamentally change what justice means. Sorry, Patrick.
Well, no, that's great. Thank you for that. And I kind of touched on what I was just going to ask, because when I was talking to Alex Vitale about this, we were stemming this idea of punishment. That is a part of the whole process of quote justice in this country, and probably in many other societies as well.
I would say all Western.
Yeah, and we were tying it into Hobbes, the British philosopher who wrote Leviathan, and his whole idea that human beings are nasty and brutish, and life is short, and we have to maintain control over human behavior through coercive states or some other overbearing hierarchy, right? Yeah, through force, and that punishment is a part of that process of rehabilitating people, I guess. And I feel like the police are like an extension of that logic. And so my difficulty, and this is why I want to get into what you're proposing with the civilian-led policing and how it would kind of embody this idea, because I think that this Hobbesian worldview is really the big problem here. It's not just that there's few bad apples in the police department. It's not just the systemic racism, which of course is a huge part of it, but it's this underlying assumption that human beings are bad and that we're all capable of extreme violence towards each other, and that in order to deal with that, we have to throw them in cages or whatever. I feel like that is a profound misunderstanding of human beings, our nature as people, that we are products of our systems, and that yeah, I mean, in your view, I mean, where does the root of this issue with policing come from? I mean,
Society believes that, right? So society largely believes this Hobbesian idea of that people are inherently bad and you must punish them, right? So we have known for 2 decades. I would love people to pull up the Vladimir Putin quote on the death penalty, where he essentially says, like, look, I totally get that we feel that this death penalty does something. And he says, I feel like it does something. But the data is clear. It doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're not doing the death penalty in Russia anymore. Guess who still has the death penalty? Us, not Russia. So,
Wow.
because they accepted that. I mean, it's been in the literature for about 2.5 decades. Certainly nailed down that punishment is not a deterrent for anything. So, but my problem with the real Hobbesian idea and that society's accepted this is that groupthink that I was talking about in the beginning, that policing is what society believes. They are empowered through society. Society can overwhelm police at any point in time. So, I mean, it's hundreds to each officer. I mean, pretty
Yeah.
so, so the issue to me is that we have that idea, but it's so patently false on its surface. We like to look at ants and we like to say, "Oh my God, look at all they have accomplished." Now step back and look at the Earth. So, I wrote a book called Crimes and Punishments in the 21st Century. And the reason why I wrote that book was because I had been arguing these ideas about civilian-led policing, about following certain, scientific data on how we get to these ideas. But I realized that we weren't arguing about the actual points. We were talking about the points, but we were fundamentally arguing worldviews and philosophies. So I wrote that book to lay out the entire philosophy of all this. And my fundamental principle is that the most prevailing characteristic, the standout of human beings, is the most cooperative species that has ever walked this planet. Our babies are the only babies that are completely fucking helpless and have dedicated, what do you have to dedicate? At least, let's say realistically, 12 years to these fuckers living on their own. We're the only species that deals with this because the only reason that is the case is because we're so extremely cooperative. I mean, we have built these extreme powers. We are in America, who just in like, a little over 250 years or so, has made the most powerful group of people to ever exist. Like, we are unbelievably cooperative. Crime has been going down dramatically. And so my fundamental principle is that all violence is a product of a biological malfunction. It goes against our fundamental principle to cooperate, and it goes against Darwinian evolution, which we all understand is definitely true. That's sure he's not 100% factual, but the overall concept is 100% true. And it is not who is the most fit to it's not the survival of the fittest. That's a misnomer. It's who is most fit to survive. So it's a natural result that the alpha species on this entire planet is the one that was most fit to survive by using the most tool that to best survive, cooperation. I mean, it's literally the reason why we are where we are is this extreme level of cooperation. It is that to think that people are inherently violent is the exact opposite of reality.
Yeah, I know, and I was just I have to tackle that subject over and over again because I don't think people like that's one of the I think first steps towards any sort of meaningful change is to begin to question those underlying assumptions that we have that we've been culturally conditioned into accepting.
So my first chapter is free will.
Yeah. Yeah.
we got to start there.
Yeah, exactly. And then to realize also that when let's say like I was some person that was reacting against what you're saying. Well, what about black on black crime? Why aren't black people addressing this within their own communities and trying to reduce the crime rates in their own spaces? I mean, what would you say to some? I mean, I don't agree. I have a lot of issues with that statement, but as sort of a devil's advocate thing, if you are seeing within your own community people behaving violently or in a kind of a negative way, why aren't people addressing that? Why aren't people tackling it on their own? The police have to come in and deal with that. So what would be the solution to something like that?
Well, they do deal with it on their own. I mean, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of groups in each of these locations dedicated to working on that kind of stuff. They don't have any power to do anything about it. They do. Another silly thing that we say, well, what are we doing about black on black crime? Well, in Chicago and in Baltimore, it's literally the biggest line item on the budget that the people pay for. So, I mean, they're literally doing more about it than anything else. But let's talk about what causes crime, because that's more important. Race isn't real. So race doesn't cause crime, right? So that's crazy. So why is this the case? Well, all of my work has brought us into there are actually 4 things that cause crime, and there are no police agencies in the entire country that are fighting these things. The number one thing that causes crime, some people think it's up to 90%. I think we're somewhere around 40 to 50%, but that's environmental toxins, most predominantly in lead poisoning. So all these neighborhoods, these black neighborhoods, have been redlined and clustered into areas of environmental toxins, and that makes them actually literally be poisoned and react with a biological malfunction of violence once they are older. It's a 20-year delay. The reason why New York City is the safest city in the entire country and eventually will be one of the safest cities in the entire world is because their public health department lowered lead levels there more than anywhere else. This has been the lead correlation has been replicated all over the world. The only place using leaded gasoline right now is fucking Iraq and Yemen. I mean, it's like no matter where we look, the most prominent causation of violence is in lead poisoning, and that just makes the human being literally have more biological functions, makes them break their cooperation spirit more often. So that's not anybody's control whether they were poisoned as a child or not. And you have to be poisoned as a child, not as an adult. So you have to be born into these poverty-stricken low-income areas or whatever. So the second thing is income inequality. And a lot of people point this towards, and it's really resource inequality. A lot of people will look at poverty and say being poor does it, but that's not true at all. It's immediately dismissed when you have hundreds, if not thousands, of tribes that are virtually penniless and completely peaceful. So that's a misnomer. It's not. It's when inequality stares you in the face. So places like Chicago and Baltimore, I mean, the inequality there stares you in the face. There's almost no middle class in either place. So you have that thing causing the exacerbation. You have local instability. Local instability is the third causation, and this is the representation of things that we see, such as taxes in an area, regressive taxation. We have things like fatherless homes, because when the father gets taken out of the home because they get locked up by the police, well, then that is a negative thing that is correlated to violence and crime going up in an area. And even if you want to take objectively, because like murder is the only thing that we have that's roughly objective. And so if you follow the murder trait, you should be able to kind of do most violence off of that. So you can look at some of these things and see the patterns and see that they're all there. Other issues would be like all the politics in Chicago and Baltimore act literally cause local instability for people. They raise property taxes on areas to pay for these more policing for these people that are already poor, kind of getting them into these cycles where you get trapped in, where you don't have bail, you have private prison industry or just prison industry period, trying to get people into that jail and putting those incentives in. So that's your third thing. And the fourth thing is the police themselves. So because the police are the response of violence that's sanctioned by the state, and they do induce trauma, and everything they do is under the threat of that trauma. Everything that is done by the law is at the point of a gun, whether it is just metaphorical or for that time frame, or it actually ends up getting there. At some point in time, if you don't abide by the state, they will kill you. It is comply or die policing. So that is the fourth biggest things for violation. So when you see these areas with black crime, crime is familiar, it's interfamiliar. So it is what you're used to being around. The vast majority of white people are killed by white people. The vast majority of Asian people are killed by Asian people. The vast majority of black people are killed by black people because it's who you're familiar with. We've structured our society to cluster us in these groups. So it's whoever you're most likely to be around. Crime is against people you know. Stranger crime is almost completely non-existent. So those are the fundamental reasons why those areas are having those things. So it's not that the question isn't why do black people commit crime. The question is why are black people in these areas that are clustered with those four causations of crime? And we know the history of that. So you can undo it, but you can't make it up by going in white neighborhoods and locking them up. You know?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well,
so that's what I mean. It's another like idea of reparations. You can't go the other way.
Right. And that just sort of points to what it seems like to be one of the major functions of police is to maintain that order.
Right.
So if there's a group there, if they're there to protect the property of the elite, of the rich, if they are there to, I'm trying to think of how to say this exactly, but it just to think that policing is really there to stop crime as a whole versus protecting certain groups of people from crime, from spilling over.
Investigate crime.
They don't investigate crime?
No. So we only investigate how a crime occurred, right? So if somebody robs a
Right.
bank, we only investigate what they did. We don't
Hmm.
investigate why. We
Right.
don't actually investigate the crime. We investigate the incident.
Yeah. Well, then, if if people are then asking police to embody another function, which is to address the underlying causes of why crime exists, I mean, are they even? I mean, they wouldn't even be recognizable to what they are now. I mean, it would be a completely different thing. It would look so completely different. I mean,
You know
when
what
I
it
see
looks like, Patrick?
what would it look like?
Being a servant.
Yeah, like serving, in the police
That's,
force. Yeah,
everybody
exactly.
says, well, what should I do? What they say to me and say, well, how should we be policed? Well, first you need to start off with a different kind of question, which is, I want to be policed this way. How will you do it? It's not
Hmm.
like you don't come asking me about how I want to execute oppression on you. That's just so silly.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it would look completely different if we were to really address the underlying causes for why crime exists in the first place. But that doesn't seem, again, to be in the interest of the police. I feel
Well,
like,
it's the system, though, Patrick. It's not the cops. The cops never think I'm going to go protect the CBF. Cops answer a
mhm,
911 call. Um, the commanders
yeah,
say, well, this property has to be, this is in our city and we have to protect it. No one is really thinking about this. Cops are robots. They've never been taught any of this stuff. So my bachelor's degree is in criminal justice. And I realized when I finished that I just got a bachelor's degree in religious studies. And that was not going to help me at all. So I switched my studies to business management. All my postgrad work was all business management because the tools to run the corporation of policing, which is aligning incentives and disincentives with your shareholders and your stakeholders, is not existent in the current structure that we have.
yeah. So I want to move into you sent me as a PDF. It's pretty short, like 9 pages, I think it was. It's civilian-led policing. Gives a good, pretty broad overview with some really good points in there of what civilian-led policing. So considering all the things that we've discussed up to this point, I don't know if it was just you or if it was in with others that you collaborated with, but you put together this concept, civilian-led policing. If you could please go over what the underlying philosophy of that is, how it would function, how it would be implemented, etc. That would be
I'm totally
fantastic.
shooting from the hip from shit that I wrote years ago, but
Well, I can quote something. I had
sure,
actually
you can post
highlighted
some things if you want to expand upon those ideas, that would be easiest. But the overview is essentially I'm a business management person. These are concepts that are well established in the literature of how you run any organization appropriately. So my question is how do I apply these things we already know how to do into the field of policing, which doesn't have any of these characteristics? So my fundamental principle was that we must create something that is perpetuating. It continually changes, and not by what I want, but what the invested shareholders in a community want. So, for the very same kind of concepts and philosophies that make Exxon go be this global dominant corporation, where they're streamlining their efficiencies and they're aligning what they do with the interests of the people who are invested in them. Now, with policing, that becomes a very broad who's invested in them because you don't necessarily have to pay to be invested in them. But when you're looking at the companies using the same principles, and that has led to Exxon like dominating the world and all these ideas. It's about aligning your force, your police force, to do what you want them to do. I create and set up the table for you to put your ideas on and have them fleshed out, not to tell you how you will be policed. I am here to tell you how uh, you can have a system that enables you to be in control of your police.
it.
Go ahead and hit those same points. So, what I will say, the basic summarization of it is you end up you say I need to align what the community wants to what the police department was. So you have to have a board, just like a business does, that aligns onto that board. Now, there's ways of getting people on there. These actually have to be actual citizens, actual community members who are shareholders invested in their location and in their jurisdiction. And they are a board that is cycled and put in through, but they go in through a lottery system, which is very critical that they can't be elected or corrupted in these other ways. So we have to get them in a lottery system where they're kind of pre-vetted and wide, and then you get them in charge to start having ideas. And you have a CEO that is in charge, just like a business, and they give the ideas and they vet them out, and then the CEO is responsible for carrying out what the people want. The current model is convincing the people that they want what you're going to do to them. So the basic concept is always just having these ideas, like any kind of what we're doing right now is a microcosm of what civilian-led policing is at each step. So there's a whole broad underlying, and we can get into the weeds of all of it. But basically, the concept isn't to come to me and talk about policing. It is for you to say, well, I want this result, I want this result, I want this result. And then we can talk about and flesh these things out like we're going to right now on how we accomplish those things. Because each location is different, each city is different, the laws that are going to stand in their way are different, the power systems are different. And whenever you're right about something, you're only right in that immediate time frame. So I cannot ever say what is right, because 5 years from now, that can be totally wrong. We don't want to put ourselves in any static situation.
Definitely.
All right,
So
points to expand upon.
no, yeah. There's so the idea, of course, was that the civilians would have much more direct control over their police departments, and that, I mean, I can't imagine that police departments would willingly do that. That they would choose to hand over a lot of their oversight and control over to a civilian population. And I think part of it is the culture that's been cultivated in police departments, where I feel like now more than ever, and I don't know if it started exactly after 9/11, but I feel like since 9/11 especially, we've seen a general trend of militarization within police departments.
The LA riots, by the way. I mean, not the LA riots, the LA shooting, the bank robbery, West Side.
Okay.
That's the start. So
Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I didn't know the exact point when you started to really see this escalation, but I've seen, I mean, you have police officers in the streets. They look like a military force that's occupying a territory, and there's this general culture that I've read about. I mean, journalists that have talked about this, where police are literally like talking about, we're like, I'm trying to think of how that would be like framed, but basically like, we're at war. I mean, we're at war with crime.
It's the war of crime. Of course it is.
Yeah. And it feels even more now since, what I mean by 9/11 is that, the sense, terrorism, that is, this home domestic terrorists or the people coming in from other countries that are going to try to, attack us on multiple fronts or whatever. We need to be prepared, and we need to militarize our police forces to address this. And to me, that just seems like a way to get people used to the idea of having essentially a military presence in their communities. And so talking about having a civilian-led model, it just seems like that would be an incredibly difficult process to enact, because I feel like that would go up against the interests of not only the police departments, but also even the federal government as well, and what I think their long-term interests are, which I think they are preparing for some sort of widespread civil unrest of some sort. I just sense that that's the case. I could be paranoid, but I feel like that's what I get a general sense of in this time that we're in.
Well, I mean, I like how you mentioned riots and civil unrest, because one of the great benefits of civilian-led policing is when the community is in charge, don't riot against us.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't do anything. You're in charge. Fix it.
Yeah.
I think that fear grips the community more than anything else, is actually being in charge of that. I really don't think police will give that much of a pushback. The main reason that you will hear the average police, now, sir, you're going to see the military guys and the militarization efforts and all that. The vast majority of them are just like playing some imaginary game in their head and would shit their pants if anything actually happened. It's a lot. It's a lot of show more than it is anything else. But so a reality that remains currently is that you still need people to kick in doors and protect walls. We need to work against that, but you're still going to need those people. But to me, those people don't pull you over in a car. They don't come to your house to figure out a family disturbance. They're not there for a kidnapping investigation. Yeah, society will still need violent enforcers for immediate situations. But I mean, there's still plenty of area for those type of people. The people like, I mean, if I did it and went back, I'd still be that person. Let's not kid ourselves. So yeah,
Hmm.
you need people like me to do those kind of things, to stand on that wall from time to time. But it's important that you're the one telling me to stand there, not another one of me, which is generally what happens now, is that so we're caught up in that. But with police, the main reason they're objecting is because what they're being told to do by the mayor and the command staff is not what they're being judged against. So when you put a civilian board up for like punishment, they're following all the metrics and incentives of the current system, but then you're judging them based off of what people perceive to be the system, that it is not actually there. So they're being told to do something, then being judged by a different standard. So it's that misalignment that is the real problem. Um, once you align those things, well, then the cops would love to not do shit. Basically, they would love it if they got paid and incentivized to go walk around the rec center. They don't want to go do dangerous stuff. I've said it a million times before, and I know a lot of people don't believe me, but most cops are pussies. So they don't want to do those dangerous things. Their spouses don't want them to do those dangerous things. My whole pitch has always been like, I feel like, I mean, for one, most of the cops that are going to object to this from the beginning, they're not servants, and I don't fucking want them there. So bye. Uh, that's how. And then the rest of the people that do want to serve, if you can, once they really do want to serve, they will do these other things. They're just being told by the community to serve with this gun.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess it is this. I guess I have my own biases. I have my own false perceptions about this.
We all do.
And
Cops are right.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, 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 yeah. And I just have a natural, not natural, but a cultivated distaste for policing in general. But I understand
Are we
that.
supposed to, Patrick?
Yeah,
Isn't
yeah.
the most American thing you should do? You're supposed to hate the police. I literally would scold people when they called me for minor calls. I'd be like, dude, you called a 23-year-old boy here to settle what you and your wife need to hash out? Like, I seriously cannot think of anything less American.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And yeah, and I mean that's something, and from my my political end of the spectrum that I'm in, a lot of leftists are talking about like, okay, we don't want the police in our communities at all. So here's a problem. If say there is a domestic abuse situation going on in your apartment next door, well, what the hell are you going to do about it?
Well,
You can call the
I would have to tell Alex, if you think the police will ever end, you're fucking insane.
Yeah.
It's about minimizing it constantly. So if the police are anti-crime, then they're essentially activists. So their entire purpose should be self-defeating. I mean, my purpose as a public educator at this point in time is that no one asks me any questions anymore. That's my dream. And the cops should feel the same way. The dream is that they're not getting called for acts of violence. It should be a self-defeating if you actually have that purpose. That's why I want to structure the fighting the causes of crime, because we'll always find new ones to pop up, but they're not necessarily going to be violent. They can be, cleaning up an area and incoming equality, so you can become voice pieces for a public health aspect. But sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, no, I was just saying that like within, I guess, organizing, it's like, well, how do we then build a means to address these community issues and do it without involving police? Because again, we've seen this over and over again involving, take Tamir Rice, right? I mean, I know you've been very vocal about that particular incident where a young black boy was shot dead by a fucking, I don't even know how to describe that person, but without. Yeah.
I mean, that was, I don't know. I went there personally, and I've never seen it was even worse going there personally to see how much of a disregard you had to have for human life to approach the situation that way.
Yeah. And I imagine like this happens all the time. I hear about people calling the police to deal with like, oh, there's a family of like a black family having a barbecue in a park, and they're not technically supposed to do that or something, so they decide to call the police, right? And all these little incidences that could have easily been avoided, but they choose to bring the people in that are most likely to cause a problem, make it even worse. And I think like getting away from that view, like the police should be the absolute, if you can get away from this idea of thinking that the police are going to solve this problem, right? Like, thinking and realizing like they're the last people we should call. when a situation arises. But again, I think that that's stemming from or pointing back to the issues that race relations and white supremacy has played in this. Certain
Well,
groups of
I don't know. I think it's probably more of a litigious society kind of concept that messes us up, because one thing we have to remember is the vast majority, I mean, well over 90% of the people that called the police on Tamir Rice are black.
oh yeah
Like that's who called the police on Tamir Rice, was another black
okay
kid living in that neighborhood. So the people that
mm,
would be asking to intervene are the people calling 911. So I don't know. I think we have more of a responsibility, and that responsibility is to send somebody that is objective, theoretically, to deal with these situations. But why does that person have to have, like, parking control agents don't have guns, and they get in incidences all the time. There's no reason to send that armed, violent enforcement wing of the government there. You can send a representative because, like, there has to be some kind of escalation. So that's the part of the escalation. Like, you need people like me, like I said, that bash heads every once in a while. But you got to go through steps. You have to have some kind of due process, essentially, even when it
yeah
comes to something as much as a noise complaint. Like, why
mm,
would you have like a SWAT team in Las Vegas? They drive around. They don't answer calls or anything like that. So why does anyone else need weapons other than somebody that doesn't handle calls and is only there to respond for when other unarmed people with authority, can't handle it or it gets dangerous? I mean, this is what parking control agents do it all the time. Go on YouTube and search people fighting with parking control agents, but somehow they manage it.
yeah there has to be a complete restructuring of our idea of how to deal with these types of situations.
But
Yeah
it's really on us as a government. We can do it. As a people, we can put in ideas like this. Where that's what I'm saying. So when I say that this is civilian led in action, so I'm the type of person that would be the CEO. I'm the person with the historical knowledge of what policing in the system is. And you're saying to me, I don't want the threat of death at someone calling to a noise complaint. And obviously that makes sense. And we act like it's super difficult, but there's an obvious solution. Don't send a representative with violence. I mean, it's like sometimes we say, oh, this is so hard, that is so hard. And I keep looking at things being like, dude, this is not fucking hard. Like, I kind of get well known for my gun control argument. And I guess it was an original idea, but I just came up with it off the top of my head saying, like, people say, oh, there's nothing we could do about getting guns off the streets. It doesn't involve taking them from you. What? There are a million different ways to incentivize people to give up an object that don't involve you oppressing them. What the fuck you say?
yeah
It's like I said, well, then cut off manufacturing. So you don't manufacture anymore. The guns stay here. You still have 300 million guns. You can then they become more valuable, which means they're less likely to be used in a crime. I mean, this is like supply and demand is one way. I mean, but there's 50 other different ideas that are just as practical.
Yeah. Well, I remember, I think when I was researching you before this interview that we have, I think you had a contention with, was it Anna Kasparian from Young Turks, and like this whole idea, like, yeah, we need to ban guns. That's like this is what is frustrating about trying to, again, these politically, ideologically charged arguments, is that because it's been discussed, if you're more prone to reading liberal, quote, liberal media, or reading more right wing, whatever it is, you're going to parrot those arguments over and over and over again. They have their own sets of data, they have their own little world that they exist in, and they think, well, look at these other countries, they banned guns and they did this and this and this, and they try to use those as examples. And I'm not saying that those aren't good examples, but you're kind of pointing to some of the contradictions in their logic, which is like, you believe that human beings should be free, that they should be able to make these decisions on their own. You're not addressing the underlying factors of why gun crime exists in the first place. It's not because we have guns as much as there's a lot of underlying social issues that go into why that's the case. But yeah, banning guns is, I personally don't believe that banning guns is going to deal with any of these problems at all. I feel like that there is some serious issues in our society that are not going to be addressed by by taking guns away. It just seems like a pretty like it's like a Band-Aid they want to put on a gaping wound. It's too big at this point. I don't think that it's going to work, but yeah.
Yeah, so I
Anyway.
mean, you just do things that figure out what will make less harm. What is the less harmful thing for us to do as a society? Which ways can we improve our society? We kind of get caught in these kind of tiny windows of seeing only our immediate circle, but we are a country doing things for either a state or for the country as a whole, and we must view society in those things. So I find it perfectly acceptable that you, as a victim, want revenge plus equality. But us as a system can't do that. So we have to do something better, something that's more moral and built in to these objective ideas. Like, so what is the group that does ACLU? So the ACLU used to be super principled and defend Nazis. But now they've gone the other way. And that was not done through force. That was done through incentives and disincentives, through funding and financing and stuff like that. Those are the same kind of things where we see all these kind of crossovers where we're changing our minds and opinions because of incentives and disincentives in the system. So that's you need to allow the system to continually craft the system, but you have to trust the system when things get really bad. As long as it's your system. I mean, don't use like the government system now, where it's like totally their. Yeah, you don't rely on a system that serves them, but when it serves you and actual society, we have to trust that. So the victim may want this person to be hanged and tortured, but as a society, we know that violence is a biological malfunction. This is in the purview of public health. We want to find ways to rehabilitate. We want to find ways that they're less likely to commit an offense when they leave, not make it more in the interest of punishment, things like that. We need to do things scientifically, not through a democracy. We argue about things, but still elite people in systems have to make executive decisions. That's just why it works, and sometimes it's hard to go with. We want to be democracies, but democracies tend to be mobocracies when it comes to having control of violence, essentially. So it's a really tough issue for us to deal with, not being in control of what that violence is, but we have to make these systems that stand outside of that and don't go by the democratic rule. They stand above them morally. It kind of represents us as a whole. Like as a country, like we may want to make the case that crime is out of control and we need to use the military to stamp it down. But we need to trust that the reason that that's in there and we haven't had a good argument to overturn it in our Constitution is because this is going to have a bad result. And I really think we're having a lot of bad results now because we've broken a lot of the things that the founders had original ideas for, and we've kind of corrupted them going forward. I think that fundamentally, the amount of guns we have in this country and the saturation has created an aura of fear, and that fear is played into the police, and that's why they're more trigger happy, because it's like this constant aura of fear, and when you perceive fear, it becomes real. So I think we're making a constitutional violation by making it impossible for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to occur. We cannot have liberty under this level of fear.
It's a very valid point.
System.
Yeah.
It's like, if we're creating these systems that could crush anyone, well, then they can crush us. So I'm way more interested in systems that can't crush anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I really like that point you make about the aura of fear, and it's really hard to cultivate any sort of society that's free under something like that. Yeah, I completely agree with that. Well, Michael, we've been talking like over an hour at this point. I think
we'll break it up into a separate discussion if we need to.
I know. There's a lot of territory we could probably cover, and I would love to talk to you again sometime if you were open to it, because I really enjoyed this conversation with you. But for now, I would just like to ask if you could direct people towards your work. I know you're not really on social media, which is probably a good thing. But you obviously, you're out there, you have plenty of podcasts that you've been on, but if there's any places that you want to direct people towards regarding what we discussed in this specific conversation, or just in your work in general, please just let us know what we can do to find you.
Absolutely. Everything is pretty much clustered under imembermedia.com, imembermedia.com, and That's my publisher, and almost everything is there on that. But I'm on almost every social media, at least putting out links other than Twitter.
Yeah.
So anybody can go ahead and jump on. Like my Instagram page is Michael A. Wood Jr. I put out a lot of links on there and give some summaries. But and my YouTube page is Michael A. Wood Jr. And that's I have a lot more material up there now. Doing a bunch. Started doing some of my own podcasts, and all the material that you can download, all the articles and links will be found on imember.com. I've imembermedia.com. I've done essays with Chicago talking about different crimes. Everything is cited and written as I would going in any other undergraduate paper I would hand in. So you can follow and snowball all the evidence backwards if you want to. So that would be the best thing to do is just go to imembermedia.com, find out the links from there. And one of the most important things I think anyone can do is arrange for me to come out and talk to them in one of their local colleges or something like that. Is the easiest thing to do because you get to trap an audience. And I think when a lot of people listen to, once I challenge one of your identities, then our instinct is to not continue it on. But we'll get a little further with that, having them there in that room and making them hear it all out.
Yeah. I think, and like I said, you've been on a lot of different podcasts. I think it's amazing that you're able to keep up that pace, and that, you know, you're presenting a lot of, again, you're challenging people, you're challenging their identities, you're challenging some of the assumptions we have about policing, about violence, about crime, about all these things. And even if, I mean, I don't think I agreed with every single thing you said today, but I really respect I really respect your perspective. Like, that's the point, right? Is to have this dialogue and to try to come at it as objectively as possible. So I thank you for that. You have a really clarifying perspective. So thank you for the work that you've done, man.
Thank you, brother. Anytime.
Generally dry day on Wednesday with sunny periods. However, there may be more cloud in the southeast where it will be breezier. After a chilly start, it will be mostly dry on Thursday with some sunny spells. However, it may be rather cloudy in the southeast. Patchy rain will arrive in the north.